The new Sword Art Online game is finally out, and as predicted, it's a complete mess. The Sword Art Online fans must hate how I'm always right about this franchise being a dumpster fire. The second I saw the first trailer, I knew exactly where this was headed. Everything about it screamed low-effort garbage. The awkward animations, the lifeless combat, the empty-looking environments, and the recycled ideas were all there from day one. Somehow people still convinced themselves that it was going to be different this time. Well, look how that turned out. I feel like I deserve a trophy at this point because my prediction couldn't have been more accurate. I called this game trash and said it looked awful months ago, and that's exactly what it ended up being. You didn't need insider information or early access to come to that conclusion. All you needed were functioning eyeballs and a little common sense. Every time a new Sword Art Online game is announced, the exact same cycle repeats itself. Fans convince themselves that this is the game that's going to redeem the franchise. The trailers drop, everyone starts hyping it up, and people swear the developers have figured it out. They talk about how this one looks different, how they've learned from past mistakes, and how this is going to be the comeback everyone has been waiting for. Then launch day arrives, the reviews are mostly negative, players start pointing out the same problems the series has had for years, and suddenly the excuses come flooding in. The next update will fix it. It's better 20 hours in. You don't understand who it's for. This game is no different. At this point, predicting a bad Sword Art Online game is like predicting the sun will rise tomorrow. It's not some incredible feat of analysis. It's just paying attention to the franchise's track record because history keeps repeating itself without fail. If Sword Art Online has been putting out disappointing games, movies, and stories for over a decade, it's not suddenly going to wake up one morning and become a masterpiece. That's not how reality works. A franchise doesn't spend 10 plus years making the same mistakes, ignoring the same criticisms, and then magically stumble into greatness. That's just pure copium, especially when it's largely the same people calling the shots. If the creative direction hasn't changed, why would the results? You can't keep following the same playbook, making the same bad decisions, and expect a completely different outcome. That's like microwaving the same frozen dinner every night and acting shocked when it still tastes terrible. It's the longest running cycle of denial I've ever seen. At some point, you have to accept that the franchise is exactly what it has shown itself to be. After more than a decade of trash, expecting Sword Art Online to suddenly become great isn't optimism. It's fantasy.
One of the harshest reviews I found gave the game a brutal 3 out of 10, and after reading through their points, it's honestly hard to argue with a lot of what they're said. Their biggest complaint is that this game completely wastes one of the greatest settings in anime. Aincrad is supposed to be this massive, mysterious floating castle with 100 unique floors full of secrets, hidden bosses, and endless opportunities for exploration. Instead, they say the game feels like a generic Unreal Engine action RPG with a Sword Art Online skin slapped on top. According to the review, the game advertises itself as an open-world adventure, but in reality you're constantly being pushed through narrow, linear maps filled with invisible walls and arbitrary progression gates. Rather than encouraging exploration, it actually punishes you for trying. Something as simple as jumping off a small ledge can instantly kill your character and send you right back where you started, making the world feel more restrictive than immersive. They also criticized the game's lack of variety. Enemies are recycled over and over again, dungeons are heavily copy-pasted, and after just a few hours you've supposedly seen almost everything the game has to offer. That's especially disappointing for a setting that should have felt fresh every time you reached a new floor. The story doesn't fare much better either. The reviewer describes it as slow, forgettable, and overloaded with dialogue that drags on without saying anything interesting. Even worse, you're forced to sit through a 3 to 5 hour opening before you're even allowed to create your own character, despite character creation being one of the game's biggest selling points. Outside of combat, they say the world feels almost lifeless. NPC interaction is incredibly limited, companion customization barely exists, and both ally and enemy AI regularly get stuck on rocks, run into walls, or simply stop functioning altogether. On PC, mouse and keyboard support is apparently so poorly implemented that some key bindings can't even be changed. Their conclusion is probably the most damning part of the entire review. They don't think the biggest problem is that the game is bad. They think that it completely wastes the incredible potential of Aincrad itself. Based on everything they pointed out, it's hard not to come away thinking Bandai Namco played it incredibly safe. When you're charging a full $70 for a game built around one of the most iconic worlds in anime, fans expect something ambitious. According to this reviewer, the game delivers something that's visually impressive on the surface but shallow almost everywhere else. Another disappointed player said this was the first negative Steam review they've ever written, which says a lot about just how much this game let them down. They were so disappointed that they actually refunded it, even though they still believe the game has the potential to become what Sword Art Online fans have been asking for. One of their biggest frustrations was how little freedom the game gives you right from the start. Even if you tell the game you don't want a party member, you're still forced to travel with an NPC, and the lengthy prologue can't be skipped. That's a terrible first impression for a game that's supposed to let you create your own adventure in Aincrad. They also criticized the lack of rewarding gameplay. Even on the hardest difficulty, regular enemies still go down in just a couple of hits, making combat feel shallow instead of challenging. But what really bothered them was everything that's missing. There's no fishing, no cooking, no multiplayer, no guilds, and almost no meaningful interaction with NPCs outside of a couple of vendors. For a series built around the idea of players living inside a virtual MMORPG, those omissions are hard to overlook. Instead of feeling like you're surviving in a living online world, they said you end up feeling like just another background NPC with no real purpose. Exploration was another major disappointment. Every time they wanted to venture beyond the designated area, the game simply told them no. That's the exact opposite of what fans expect from Aincrad, a world that's supposed to reward curiosity and discovery. I think this review perfectly sums up why so many fans are frustrated. The biggest issue isn't just that features are missing. It's that they're the kinds of features people naturally associate with Sword Art Online. When you remove things like guilds, multiplayer, player interaction, and meaningful exploration, you're stripping away the fantasy that made people want a Sword Art Online game in the first place. The reviewer ends by calling the game a total letdown, and based on everything they listed, it's easy to understand why. Another reviewer had one major warning for anyone thinking this is the open-world Sword Art Online game they've been waiting for. It isn't. According to them, exploration is practically non-existent. Instead of freely wandering Aincrad, you're locked into specific quest areas, and only the parts of the map tied to your current objective are even available. If you stumble across something interesting like a dungeon, you can't just go in and explore it. If you don't have the quest for it yet, you're simply out of luck. The reviewer admits the game has its fun moments, but they argue that anyone expecting the freedom of a traditional action RPG or hack-and-slash adventure is going to be seriously disappointed. Honestly, this criticism keeps showing up over and over again, and that's a huge red flag. Aincrad should feel like a world begging you to get lost in it, not one that constantly tells you where you can and can't go. Locking exploration behind quest progression completely undermines the sense of adventure that made the original series so appealing. At a $70 price point, it's easy to see why this reviewer felt the game simply doesn't offer enough freedom to justify the cost. One review that really stood out came from someone who isn't just a casual player, they're a hardcore Sword Art Online fan. They've read the light novels, the progressive novels, watched the anime, and described Sword Art Online as something that's genuinely special to them. And despite all of that, they still walked away incredibly disappointed. That's honestly one of the biggest recurring themes I'm seeing with this game. Even the people who love Sword Art Online the most don't seem happy with what Bandai Namco delivered. The reviewer says the game is absolutely gorgeous visually, but once you get past the graphics, the illusion quickly falls apart. The world feels empty, exploration is heavily restricted, enemies are recycled over and over again, and instead of discovering exciting new places, you're mostly following predetermined paths while fighting the same monsters and activating yet another rest point. They were also disappointed with how little freedom the game gives you to roleplay your own character. Even though you're supposed to create your own survivor in Aincrad, they felt more like a passenger watching someone else's story unfold than the hero of their own adventure. That's a major problem for a game that's supposed to let players live out the Sword Art Online fantasy. Combat didn't impress them either. They describe it as repetitive, with most encounters boiling down to spamming sword skills against weak enemies, while boss fights rely more on oversized area attacks than engaging mechanics. They also criticize the companion AI, saying teammates are often completely useless in battle and fail to contribute when you actually need them. The story was another letdown. Instead of letting players experience the terrifying first days of being trapped inside Aincrad, the game skips ahead and throws you into the adventure with very little build-up. According to this reviewer, it ends up feeling rushed and emotionally hollow, missing some of the most important moments that made the original story so memorable. In the end, They admit they'll probably finish the game simply because they're such a huge Sword Art Online fan. But even they say this isn't the Sword Art Online experience they've been waiting for, and they strongly recommend waiting for a sale instead of paying the full $70 asking price. I think that's one of the most telling reviews so far. When even the franchise's biggest fans, the people who know these novels inside and out, are saying the game fails to capture what makes Sword Art Online special, it's hard to ignore. The visuals may look the part, but according to this reviewer, the gameplay, world, and overall experience never live up to the incredible potential of the source material. Another review absolutely tears this game apart, even calling it a soulless creation that would make Kayaba Akihiko look away in disgrace. That's a pretty brutal way to describe a Sword Art Online game, but after reading their complaints, you can see where that frustration comes from. Their biggest criticism is that the game disguises itself as an open-world RPG when it really isn't. They describe most of the experience as a repetitive walking simulator where you're constantly following linear quest paths, fighting the same weak enemies, and being confined to invisible boundaries despite seeing a much larger world sitting just beyond them. According to the reviewer, you never truly feel free to explore Aincrad. They also weren't impressed with the gameplay loop. Treasure chests are filled with mostly junk, equipment progression feels shallow, puzzles are forgettable, and character customization is more limited than they expected. They even point out that dual wielding, one of the most iconic fighting styles in Sword Art Online, isn't available, which feels like a strange omission for a game built around the franchise. Combat receives just as much criticism. While the flashy animations look cool at first, the reviewer says they actually interrupt the flow of battle because enemies keep attacking while you're locked into cinematic finishing animations. On top of that, they mention awkward targeting, clunky controls, enemies and companions getting stuck on the environment, and AI that simply doesn't behave intelligently. Rather than making combat exciting, they felt it became repetitive and boring after only a short time. They were also disappointed by the lack of multiplayer. For a series inspired by an MMORPG, they argue it's strange that you're forced to experience the entire adventure alone with AI companions instead of teaming up with other players. By the end of the review, they say the game feels unfinished, like a half-baked attempt at recreating Sword Art Online. That simply doesn't justify its premium price. In fact, they regret buying it altogether and believe it's only worth considering at a steep discount, hoping that modders eventually turn it into the game it should have been. I think what's interesting about this review is that it echoes so many of the same complaints we've already heard. The restricted exploration, repetitive combat, weak AI, lack of meaningful progression, and missing multiplayer keep coming up again and again. When completely different players are all pointing to the same problems, it starts to paint a pretty consistent picture of why the game has been receiving such a negative reception. One reviewer said this was actually the first negative review they've ever felt compelled to write, simply because they couldn't justify staying silent about a game charging $70 while delivering what they considered such a disappointing experience. According to them, the marketing built up expectations that this would finally be the Sword Art Online game fans had been waiting for. Instead, they were met with clunky combat, almost non-existent exploration, and gameplay systems that constantly worked against the player instead of adding to the experience. They described the core gameplay loop as mind-numbing. Most quests boil down to running back and forth collecting resources so you can craft better gear, occasionally stopping to fight the same uninspired enemies before repeating the exact same process again. Long quests don't mean meaningful content, and this reviewer felt the game confused padding with actual gameplay. They also pointed out how many bizarre design decisions kept pulling them out of the experience. Your character can't survive even a tiny drop without instantly failing. Large sections of the map remain inaccessible whether you're in a quest or not, and the interface is so poorly designed that accidentally opening a menu during combat can leave you helpless while enemies beat on you. Those kinds of issues don't just feel unpolished, they make the game feel unfinished. The reviewer even laid out exactly what they think would be required to make the game worth its asking price. Overhaul the combat, actually let players explore Aincrad as an open world, add multiplayer to a franchise built around an MMORPG, and completely redesign the clunky menus and user interface. What really stood out to me was how frustrated they sounded by the end. They said they normally keep their opinions to themselves, but they felt obligated to warn other people because they didn't want fans getting suckered into buying the game simply because it has the Sword Art Online name. attached to it. And honestly, that's becoming a pattern with these reviews. People aren't just saying the game is mediocre, they're saying it failed to deliver on the fantasy that sold them on it in the first place. When players feel the need to warn others not to buy a $70 game based on the reputation of the anime alone, that's about as damning an indictment as you can make. This reviewer doesn't waste any time. Almost every question they ask about the game is immediately followed by the same answer: no. Does the game encourage exploration? According to them, absolutely not. Even though the maps look massive, the game constantly pulls you back toward your objective whenever you try to wander too far. Instead of letting you freely explore Aincrad, it keeps you on a leash, making the world feel far more restrictive than the marketing suggested. Combat didn't impress them either. They argue that it doesn't feel fresh or significantly better than previous Sword Art Online games, making it another area where the game fails to evolve. The one thing they were willing to praise was the graphics. They admit the game looks fantastic on max settings, but they also make it clear that pretty visuals can't carry an entire game. Once the initial wow factor wears off, you're still left with the same shallow gameplay underneath. The story was another major disappointment. They felt the opening starts off strong with Kaiba's announcement, only to immediately skip ahead by an entire month, completely robbing players of the terrifying early days trapped inside Aincrad. Those are some of the most iconic moments in the entire series, and according to this reviewer, the game rushes right past them. They also describe the world as feeling completely dead. Despite Sword Art Online revolving around thousands of players trapped inside a virtual MMO, they say you rarely see anyone besides your AI companion. That destroys the illusion that you're actually living inside a massive online world. To make matters worse, your custom character barely speaks at all, leaving them feeling more like an empty shell than an actual protagonist. The loot system didn't escape criticism either. They complain that enemies constantly shower you with weapons and crafting materials, making loot feel meaningless, while useful items like healing supplies are strangely uncommon. Even, the in-game economy offers little challenge because money quickly becomes abundant. Their conclusion is about as harsh as it gets. They recommend trying the demo if you're curious, but strongly advise waiting for a deep sale because, in their opinion, this game comes nowhere close to justifying a $70 price tag. They even accuse the developers of doing the bare minimum while expecting players to pay premium AAA prices. At this point, it's becoming impossible to ignore the pattern. Review after review keeps coming back to the same issues: restricted exploration, a lifeless world, disappointing combat, and the feeling that the game never lives up to the incredible potential of Sword Art Online. The graphics may impress at first glance, but according to players like this, everything beneath the surface leaves a lot to be desired. Another reviewer didn't hold back, saying they flat out do not recommend the game and arguing that it's nowhere near worth its $70 asking price. In their opinion, this feels more like a $30 game that's been dressed up with a premium price tag. Even after playing just the demo, they felt the warning signs were obvious. The towns and dungeons came across as empty and lifeless, making Aincrad feel less like a thriving world and more like a collection of disconnected environments with very little going on. They also criticized some of the game's baffling design choices. Instead of being able to swap equipment or spend character growth points from your inventory, you're forced to return to an inn every single time. It's the kind of unnecessary inconvenience that doesn't add realism. It just wastes the player's time. Things got even worse when they discovered their demo save wouldn't transfer into the full game. That was apparently the final straw, because they immediately refunded it. One of the harshest comparisons they make is to Bandai's old PS2 hack games. Despite being decades older, they argue those games offered a stronger story, deeper exploration, more player freedom, and significantly more content. That's a pretty embarrassing comparison when a modern $70 release is being unfavorably stacked against PlayStation 2-era RPGs. By the end of the review, their frustration extends beyond just this game. As someone who's been playing video games since the late 1980s, they say this is another example of developers charging premium prices while delivering products that feel completely lacking in vision and passion. Honestly, that's a devastating criticism. When players start saying they'd rather go back and play RPGs from over 20 years ago because those games better capture the feeling of adventure and exploration, It says a lot about how badly the game missed the mark for some fans. Another reviewer's verdict is simple. They can't recommend this game under any circumstances, regardless of the price. That's about as harsh as it gets. Their biggest complaint is that the game never really evolves. The 4-hour prologue is already slow and repetitive, but according to them, the moment the real story begins, nothing changes. You're still spending most of your time running long distances to the next objective, cutting down the same weak enemies in a single hit, and then hoping your AI companion doesn't become a liability during boss fights. Perhaps the most damning criticism is that they don't even think the game feels like Sword Art Online. They say if someone had shown them gameplay without the title attached, they never would have guessed it was a Sword Art Online game at all. To them, it feels like a generic action RPG that just happens to have Sword Art Online's name slapped on the box. They were equally critical of the PC version. According to the review, it feels like a rushed console port with awkward keyboard controls, limited graphics options, and missing features that PC players have come to expect. Performance doesn't help matters either, with the reviewer arguing the game demands far more powerful hardware than its visuals actually justify. Even outside of the technical issues, they felt the overall presentation lacked polish. The animations, dialogue, and world interactions all came across as cheap, making the entire project feel less like a fully realized AAA release and more like something pushed out the door before it was ready. I think that minimum viable product comment really sums up how they feel. Instead of delivering the ambitious Sword Art Online experience fans have been waiting years for, they believe Bandai Namco settled for the bare minimum, a functional action RPG released at a premium price. At this point, the criticism is becoming impossible to ignore. Whether it's the repetitive gameplay, lifeless world, weak AI, restricted exploration, or the feeling that this barely resembles Sword Art Online beyond the branding, review after review keeps arriving at the same conclusion. For many players, the game doesn't just disappoint. It feels like a missed opportunity on almost every level. This reviewer starts with one of the most brutal opening lines I've seen, saying they never imagined a game with this much hype could end up being a load of garbage. And after reading through their review, it's clear they feel almost every part of the game failed to live up to expectations. To be fair, they do acknowledge a few positives. They say the graphics are genuinely impressive, especially on max settings, and they believe the game had a lot of potential. They even admit that the limited exploration can be enjoyable when the game actually lets you do it. Unfortunately, that's where the praise ends. Their biggest complaint is that the game constantly advertises freedom while doing everything possible to take it away. You can't simply head out and explore Aincrad whenever you want. Instead, you're forced to accept quests before you're allowed into specific areas, turning what should have been an open adventure into a series of tightly controlled instances. They also criticized the painfully long prologue, pointing out that you have to slog through hours of it before you can even customize the character you bought the game to create. Worse yet, they say the game never gets any better after that. According to them, once the prologue ends, the gameplay loop barely changes. It's just more running from objective to objective, fighting enemies, and repeating the same formula over and over. Combat didn't impress them either. They describe it as extremely basic, boiling down to little more than attacking, dodging, and occasionally blocking. Instead of creating genuinely challenging encounters, they argue the game simply throws extra enemies into boss fights to overwhelm the player, which feels frustrating rather than rewarding. They also call out inconsistent enemy balancing, confusing progression systems, and a cast of characters they found completely forgettable. By the end, they felt the game had almost nothing to offer beyond repetitive combat and heavily restricted exploration. What really stood out to me was their conclusion. They admit they kept forcing themselves to play because they were convinced it would eventually get better. But in their words, it never did. The game after the prologue is basically the prologue all over again with a different coat of paint. That's a devastating criticism, because it suggests the core gameplay never evolves. And once again, we're hearing the same complaints. Restricted exploration, repetitive gameplay, shallow combat, and wasted potential. This reviewer goes even further, saying they wouldn't recommend the game unless it was discounted by around 85%, which tells you exactly how little value they think this $70 release actually offers. This review is especially disappointing because it comes from someone who actually loved the beta. They went into the full release expecting Bandai Namco to build on what worked, only to come away saying they felt completely cheated. According to them, the beta hinted at the Sword Art Online game fans had always wanted. The mechanics, characters, and exploration showed real promise, and they believed the full release would simply expand on that foundation. Instead, they say the opposite happened. The writing became weaker, exploration was replaced with small, restrictive quest zones, enemies were padded out with inflated health pools, and the overall experience felt like a downgrade instead of an improvement. One comparison really says it all. They mention buying a completely different MMORPG for just $15 and claim it delivers a better experience than this game, despite the game costing several times as much. That's a brutal indictment for a title carrying one of anime's biggest franchises. What makes this review hit even harder is that it comes from a genuine Sword Art Online fan. They make it clear they aren't refunding the game because the series means too much to them personally. But they also admit they can't honestly recommend it to anyone else. They even lay out exactly what they think the game is missing. More weapon variety, deeper combat, meaningful build customization, impactful equipment choices, better writing, and far more player freedom. In other words, they want a game that actually embraces the creativity and role-playing potential that Sword Art Online is known for instead of reducing everything to, this weapon does more damage. The saddest part of the review comes at the very end. They say they wanted this to be the definitive Sword Art Online game, the one they could proudly recommend to everyone. Instead, they see it as little more than a trophy of their loyalty to the franchise, not a game they genuinely enjoy playing. Honestly, I think that's one of the most heartbreaking criticisms in this entire roundup. When even passionate, lifelong Sword Art Online fans are saying they only kept the game because of their love for the series, not because the game itself earned it, that speaks volumes about how badly the game disappointed the audience it was supposed to satisfy. This reviewer doesn't mince words, calling the game boring and tedious almost immediately. Less than an hour into the experience, they still hadn't even reached the character creator, despite custom character creation being one of the game's biggest selling points. Instead, they describe being thrown into a confusing wall of tutorials and combat commands for controlling AI companions, expecting players to memorize a huge number of inputs before they've even had a chance to enjoy the game. Rather than easing players into the mechanics, they felt the game overwhelms them from the very beginning. They also criticized the decision to lock players into controlling a generic protagonist for hours before finally allowing them to create the character they actually bought the game to play. That's a complaint we've seen repeated throughout these reviews, and it continues to be one of the game's biggest points of frustration. Another issue they point out is the lack of a pause feature. If you have to step away for any reason, whether it's family, work, or just everyday life, your character can simply die while you're gone and send you back to your last checkpoint. It's another design decision that they felt only added frustration instead of immersion. Even though they admit the game runs reasonably well, they don't think the technical performance makes up for what they describe as an unimaginative experience. According to them, it never really feels like a true RPG where your choices matter, and they argue that older games like Skyrim and Fallout New Vegas still offer more engaging combat, better storytelling, and significantly more player freedom. Their recommendation is pretty telling. They say the only people who should even consider buying this are fans who are desperate for anything set in the Sword Art Online universe. Otherwise, they believe there are countless RPGs that deliver a much better experience. The review ends with one of the funniest and harshest comparisons I've read so far. They say they were hoping for an exciting adventure through Aincrad, but instead the game reminded them of their time in the army on a 12-mile ruck march in the rain. That's not exactly the kind of journey anyone wants from a game that's supposed to capture the excitement and freedom of Sword Art Online. This reviewer sums up the entire game in just 2 words: wasted potential. And honestly, after reading everything they had to say, it's hard to argue with that conclusion. They start by criticizing the combat, saying it never feels satisfying. Enemy attacks aren't communicated clearly, making it difficult to tell what can actually hit you, while enemies instantly snap to face the player, making certain playstyles like hit-and-run tactics almost impossible. Instead of rewarding strategy, they felt the combat constantly fought against the player. They also questioned several strange design decisions surrounding character creation. Not only are you forced to spend hours playing a preset protagonist before making your own character, but they also found it bizarre that you can't even choose your starting character's gender despite official artwork showing multiple versions. The PC controls were another sore spot. According to the review, there are simply too many actions mapped to individual keys, no support for secondary keybinds, and the overall control scheme ends up feeling awkward and uncomfortable to use for long periods. Beyond the gameplay, they felt the world itself lacked any real life. Even cities packed with NPCs come across as eerily empty because there's almost no ambient conversation or background activity. Characters barely move, clothing and hair show very little natural motion, and even enemies feel stiff. The result, they argue, is a world that looks populated but never actually feels alive. Ironically, one of the few compliments they give is that the game runs well. But even that isn't enough to save it. Their overall impression is that the game simply wasn't finished. They say it feels like a game that still needed months of additional testing and polish before release. Perhaps the most discouraging part of the review is how little faith they have in its future. Instead of believing updates will eventually fix the experience, they say this feels like the kind of game that has fundamental problems at its core, problems that patches alone probably can't solve. And that's another criticism that keeps surfacing throughout these reviews. Players aren't just pointing out bugs or minor annoyances. Many of them believe the game's biggest flaws are baked into its very design, making the game feel less like an unfinished masterpiece and more like a missed opportunity from the ground up. This reviewer doesn't sugarcoat their opinion at all, calling the game absolutely terrible after putting around 10 hours into it. Their biggest complaint is just how repetitive the experience becomes. They estimate that nearly 8 of those 10 hours were spent doing little more than running from one quest marker to the next. Eventually, combat became so uninteresting that they simply started sprinting past enemies altogether, and even that didn't make the game any more enjoyable. What makes this review particularly harsh is that they genuinely tried to give the game a fair chance. They kept pushing forward, hoping things would eventually improve, but according to them, the exact opposite happened. The further they played, the worse the experience became. The breaking point came after spending roughly an hour searching for a particular swordsman, only for the entire objective to feel completely pointless. That was enough for them to quit altogether. Their final recommendation couldn't be much clearer. They don't just say the game isn't worth its $70 asking price. They argue it isn't worth playing at all. In fact, they go so far as to say they wouldn't recommend it even if it were completely free. That's an incredibly brutal conclusion, but it also reinforces one of the biggest themes running through these reviews. Many players feel that the game simply doesn't respect their time. When hours are spent running between objectives instead of exploring, discovering, or experiencing meaningful gameplay, it's easy to understand why so many people walked away feeling frustrated rather than entertained. Here's another review from a longtime Sword Art Online fan, and once again, the verdict is overwhelmingly negative. Despite being excited enough to buy the Ultimate Edition, they say they simply can't recommend the game in its current state. One of their biggest complaints is the complete lack of variety. After 8 hours of gameplay, they say they'd only encountered a handful of enemy types. Mostly the same boars, wolves, bears, insects, plants, and kobolds repeated over and over. They even make the point that if any other game launched with such a tiny selection of enemies, it would be ripped apart by critics, so they don't think this game should get a pass just because it has the Sword Art Online name attached to it. They also describe the opening hours as painfully slow. Since they had already played the beta, having to spend another 4 hours replaying the prologue only made things worse, saying they were practically falling asleep before the real game even began. Combat didn't fare much better. According to them, once they found an effective build, every fight became exactly the same. Upgrade one weapon, stack health, spam the same sword skills, and watch nearly everything fall over. They argue there's almost no incentive to experiment because the progression system encourages sticking with a single weapon instead of trying new playstyles. Exploration was another huge disappointment. Rather than rewarding curiosity, they say most treasure chests contain junk that quickly becomes useless. Instead of discovering exciting gear or meaningful rewards, players are often left with disposable items they'll never actually use. Over time, they reached the point where they didn't even want to search for treasure anymore because it simply wasn't worth the effort. Their overall conclusion is that the game feels half-baked. Between the lack of enemy variety, repetitive combat, disappointing exploration, and shallow progression systems, they believe the game never delivers the sense of adventure fans were hoping for. What stands out most, though, is how many of these reviews come from dedicated Sword Art Online fans. These are the people who should have been this game's biggest supporters. Instead, they're telling other fans not to buy it, at least not until it's heavily discounted. When even the franchise's most loyal audience is saying, "Wait for a sale," that's a pretty clear sign that something went seriously wrong. This reviewer says they gave a Sword Art Online game a chance for the very first time, and after playing the game, they're pretty confident it'll be their last. According to them, the game lost them within the first hour. They describe the opening as an endless tutorial that drags on far longer than it needs to, constantly interrupting the player instead of letting them actually enjoy the game. They were also annoyed that the game forces an NPC companion into your party even if you explicitly decline, making player choice feel completely meaningless from the very beginning. They also criticized several strange design decisions, including sections where you're forced to walk instead of run for no apparent reason. Rather than making the experience feel more cinematic, they argue it just slows the game down even further. The PC version came under heavy fire as well. According to the review, the keyboard controls feel terrible, the user interface is clunky to navigate, and the entire game comes across like a rushed console port that received very little attention before release. They were especially surprised that performance was worse than other graphically demanding games despite the game not looking nearly as impressive. But the biggest deal-breaker was the overall structure of the game. Instead of giving players the freedom to explore Aincrad, they say the game traps you in a long, linear narrative and funnels you from mission to mission with very little room to do your own thing. That's the exact opposite of what they were expecting from a game based on Sword Art Online. In the end, they decided not to take the risk. Even though some people told them the game eventually gets better, they weren't willing to spend hours waiting to find out and potentially lose their refund window. So they refunded it. That's another trend that's hard to ignore. A surprising number of these negative reviews come from players who gave up very early, not because they were impatient, but because the game's opening failed to convince them there was anything worth sticking around for. When your first few hours leave players feeling trapped in tutorials, forced story sequences, and linear missions instead of exploring the game, it's easy to see why so many people decided to walk away before the game ever had a chance to win them back. This reviewer says they're the kind of person who never refunds games. They'll usually force themselves to finish even terrible releases. But after 6 hours with the game, they reached the point where they felt obligated to warn other people away from it. Their prediction is brutal. They believe maybe 10% of players will enjoy the game, while the other 90% are going to hate it. The biggest reason? They describe the game as a running simulator disguised as an action RPG. According to them, most missions consist of spending 15 to 20 minutes running across empty maps, instantly deleting weak enemies, fighting a short boss, collecting forgettable rewards, and then repeating the exact same process somewhere else. They even joke that they wanted to install a speed hack, not because the game was difficult, but simply to cut down on the endless amount of time spent running from objective to objective. That's a pretty devastating criticism when the gameplay itself is so repetitive that players are looking for ways to skip large portions of it. Combat didn't escape criticism either. They argue that despite advertising multiple weapon types, the skills are so repetitive that every weapon feels almost identical. Combined with an incredibly small enemy roster, they say the game quickly becomes an endless cycle of fighting the same handful of monsters over and over again with very little variation. Exploration, which should have been one of the game's greatest strengths, is described as completely pointless. Large areas of the world exist with almost no reason to visit them, and the quality of life systems constantly force players to teleport back to town just to manage inventory or spend skill points before teleporting all the way back out again. Perhaps the harshest criticism comes when they compare the game to something that would have been acceptable over 20 years ago. In their opinion, the game doesn't feel like a modern AAA release at all. It feels like an unfinished early access project that still needs years of development before it could justify its current price tag. And then they end with one final piece of advice. Run. Honestly, that's one of the strongest recurring messages throughout these reviews. Players aren't just disappointed because the game has a few flaws. They're saying the core gameplay loop itself is fundamentally repetitive. When people start describing a Sword Art Online game as a lifeless running simulator where you spend more time traveling than actually playing, it's easy to understand why the reception has been so overwhelmingly negative. This reviewer had already spent 11 hours with the game, and even after all that time, they were still asking one simple question. Where did the $70 go? According to them, the majority of the experience consists of either running from one objective to another or sitting through lengthy cutscenes. Rather than feeling like an open-world adventure, they describe the game as constantly funneling players down predetermined paths where stepping outside the intended route only prevents you from making progress. They also criticize the maps, saying many of them feel copy-pasted and designed more to waste the player's time than to encourage exploration. Instead of rewarding curiosity, the game repeatedly sends you running in circles through environments that quickly start to blend together. Even as a Sword Art Online fan, they struggled to justify the premium price. They kept waiting for some feature that would finally make everything click. Whether it was multiplayer, a major gameplay mechanic, or something that explained why the game costs so much. But after 11 hours, they still hadn't found it. Combat earned faint praise at best. They admit it isn't terrible, but they also say it never becomes exciting. In fact, they claim they were sometimes able to sit back and watch their AI companions defeat bosses for them, which doesn't exactly scream engaging gameplay. What really stands out is that this isn't someone who gave up after an hour or two. They invested over 10 hours trying to find something that justified the asking price, and even then they were still left wondering what exactly they had paid for. That keeps becoming one of the biggest themes across these reviews. It's not just that players think the game is disappointing. They're struggling to understand how Bandai Namco believed this was a $70 game in the first place. When even fans who stick with it for over 10 hours are still searching for reasons to justify the price, that's a pretty serious criticism. This reviewer says the game feels unfinished from the moment you start playing. They point to floating plants, trees that don't even touch the ground, bugs throughout the world, and even cutscenes where the characters' lips don't sync with the dialogue. To them, this doesn't feel like a polished $70 release. It feels like something that should still be in early access. Exploration was another major frustration. According to them, you're constantly interrupted by enemies that either spot you from absurd distances or seemingly spawn right on top of you, making it exhausting to simply travel from one objective to another. And even then, they argue there's barely any reason to explore because most of the time you're just making a small detour for another forgettable treasure chest before getting pushed back onto the main path. Combat didn't make things any better. They describe it as more of a chore than an enjoyable gameplay system because most enemies die in a single hit anyway. Instead of feeling satisfying, every fight just becomes another obstacle slowing you down on the way to your destination. The reviewer does admit the visuals are impressive, but they believe that's where the positives end. In their opinion, Bandai Namco did the bare minimum required to call this a game before turning around and charging full triple a price for it. They also criticize just how little there is to do outside of combat. Your custom character barely participates in the story, towns offer almost nothing beyond picking up quests. There are no meaningful friendship or bonding systems with companions, and conversations with NPCs are extremely limited. Even when the game appears to let you explore somewhere interesting, it quickly forces you back into the designated play area, making the world feel surprisingly restrictive. By the end, they say they were left fighting the same bosses over and over while dealing with technical issues, repetitive gameplay, and a world that never lived up to its potential. Their final takeaway is one we've been hearing again and again. They had high hopes for the game, but there just isn't enough here to justify either the hype or the $70 price tag. At this point, it's becoming clear that the disappointment goes far beyond a few isolated complaints. Review after review describes a game that feels rushed, repetitive, and unfinished. And when players start comparing a brand new AAA release to an early access project, that's one of the harshest criticisms a game can receive. This reviewer says one design decision alone was enough to make them refund the game. After finishing the demo, they expected to jump into new content. Instead, they were forced to replay the beginning all over again. Even worse, the collectibles from the demo carried over, but the travel points didn't. So instead of giving players something new to experience, the game has them sprint across the exact same starting area a second time with absolutely no incentive to explore because they'd already collected everything the first time around. According to the reviewer, it feels like the developers deliberately padded the game's length by making players repeat content they've already finished. After potentially spending close to 10 hours in the opening section, the last thing they wanted was to replay the same map before finally reaching anything new. They also echo many of the same complaints we've been hearing throughout these reviews. The game quickly turns into a walking simulator where most basic enemies die in a single hit, leaving little challenge or excitement between the long stretches of running from one objective to the next. The review ends with a surprisingly backhanded compliment. They call it the best Sword Art Online game to date, but immediately point out that's an incredibly low bar. In their opinion, at least the older Sword Art Online games embraced their quirks and had some charm. This game, on the other hand, is described as all of the jank with none of the fun. Honestly, the complaint about replaying the opening might be one of the most baffling design decisions I've seen mentioned. If you're trying to hook players during those crucial first few hours, forcing them to retread the same content they already completed is a great way to kill excitement. Combined with the repetitive combat and constant backtracking, it's easy to understand why this reviewer decided they'd seen enough and asked for a refund. This reviewer doesn't hold back at all, calling the game quite possibly the worst game purchase they've made in the last decade. That's an incredibly harsh statement, especially considering how many games release every year. They immediately criticize the controls, describing them as awkward, confusing, and anything but intuitive. Instead of feeling natural, they argue the control scheme constantly gets in the way of actually enjoying the game, making it another example of how unpolished the overall experience feels. The $70 price tag comes under fire once again. According to them, there's simply no world where this game delivers enough quality to justify charging full triple a price. They believe players are paying premium money for a product that feels far below modern standards. Perhaps their most cutting criticism is how disconnected the entire game feels. They describe it as if multiple development teams each worked on separate pieces without any clear vision tying everything together. Rather than feeling like one cohesive adventure, the game comes across as a collection of mismatched ideas stitched together at the last minute. Their conclusion couldn't be any more direct. If you value your money at all, they say this is an easy pass. What's striking is how this review doesn't even focus on one specific flaw. Instead, it's criticizing the game as a whole. When players start saying an entire project feels directionless, unfinished, and not worth a premium price, that's a much deeper problem than a few bugs or questionable gameplay decisions. It's another review that paints this game as a game that simply wasn't ready, or wasn't good enough, to justify its asking price. This reviewer takes aim at one of the game's biggest design choices: the protagonist. According to them, the custom character never feels like a real character at all. They point out that, unlike most games with silent protagonists, you don't even get meaningful dialogue choices. Instead, almost every interaction boils down to nothing more than nodding your head or shaking it. They argue that if the game insists on making you experience the story through your own custom character, then that character should at least be allowed to express themselves. As it stands, they felt more like an empty mannequin than the hero of the adventure. They also criticize how disconnected the story feels from the gameplay. The narrative constantly treats your character like an inexperienced rookie who doesn't know what they're doing, yet in actual gameplay you're the one carrying the entire party. You're defeating nearly every enemy, clearing the areas, gathering materials, and doing all the heavy lifting while the story acts as if everyone else is leading the adventure. According to the reviewer, that disconnect completely breaks immersion. Even the crafting system came under fire. They argue there's barely any reason to gather resources because the game constantly hands out new weapons anyway, making one of its progression systems feel almost pointless. It's another example of a criticism we've seen pop up throughout these reviews. Players don't just think the game has repetitive gameplay, they feel many of its core systems don't even support each other. Between the silent protagonist, the contradictory storytelling, and progression mechanics that rarely feel necessary, this reviewer believes the game struggles to give players a meaningful sense of purpose from beginning to end. Here's another review from someone who openly admits they're a Sword Art Online fan, which makes their disappointment hit even harder. They say they went into the game hoping it would finally let them experience the world of Sword Art Online for themselves, but instead they found a game that still feels almost identical to the demo. According to them, the world is lifeless, NPC interaction is extremely limited, and despite the marketing, it doesn't feel like an open world at all. They compare it more to a series of dungeon-like areas than a true world you can freely explore. Combat is one of the few areas they compliment, saying it's enjoyable overall, but they still believe it lacks depth and flexibility. They also criticize the character progression, arguing that the stat system is poorly balanced because one attribute is so much stronger than the others that it discourages meaningful build variety. What really stands out is how they end the review. They didn't buy the game because they thought it looked like a great RPG. They bought it because they're a Sword Art Online fan. And despite that loyalty, they're still choosing to refund it and wait for a sale. That seems to be one of the biggest patterns across these reviews. The people who wanted this game to succeed the most are often the ones criticizing it the hardest. When longtime Sword Art Online fans are saying the world feels empty, the exploration is too restricted, and even they're unwilling to pay full price, it paints a pretty clear picture of how disappointing the game has been for its core audience. And I think that'll do it for the reviews. Honestly, I could keep going for another 10 hours if I wanted to. There are literally thousands more negative reviews saying the exact same things. Repetitive gameplay, lifeless environments, fake open-world design, shallow combat, terrible pacing, weak AI, and a complete waste of Aincrad as a setting. By this point, the pattern is impossible to ignore. This isn't a handful of angry players nitpicking minor flaws. It's hundreds of people independently arriving at the same conclusion. This is not a good game. And what makes that even more disappointing is that many of the harshest reviews aren't coming from people who hate Sword Art Online. They're coming from the franchise's biggest fans. These are people who've watched the anime, read the light novels, played the previous games, and desperately wanted the game to be the definitive Sword Art Online experience. Instead, they're refunding it, telling others to wait for massive discounts, or saying they only kept it because of their loyalty to the series. When your own fanbase is your harshest critic, that's a serious problem. The game had one of the greatest settings in anime to work with. A 100-floor death game filled with mystery, exploration, danger, and endless possibilities. Somehow, Bandai Namco turned that into a repetitive, restrictive, lifeless action RPG that feels more interested in wasting your time than rewarding your curiosity. If there's one thing these reviews make crystal clear, it's this: Sword Art Online fans didn't get the game they've been asking for over the last decade. They got another massive missed opportunity. What's really funny is seeing some Sword Art Online fans constantly making excuses for this game. Every time someone criticizes it, the response is always the same: it's made for the fans. Or, you're just not the target audience. Really? Because after reading all of these reviews, that excuse completely falls apart. The people leaving. Many of the harshest reviews aren't outsiders. They're not people who hate Sword Art Online. They're longtime fans who watched the anime, read the light novels, played the previous games, bought the Ultimate Edition, and genuinely wanted this game to succeed. These are the exact people Bandai Namco was supposed to impress. And what are they saying? They're refunding the game. They're calling it a lifeless, repetitive disappointment. They're telling people to wait for a deep sale. Some are even saying this is the biggest gaming disappointment they've had in years. So if the game was supposedly made for the fans, and the fans themselves are overwhelmingly criticizing it, then what's the excuse now? At some point, you have to stop blaming the audience and start looking at the product. When the franchise's most loyal supporters are saying the game failed to capture what made Sword Art Online special, that's not a problem with the players. That's a problem with the game. At some point, some Sword Art Online fans really need to get off their high horse. Every time someone points out legitimate problems with this game, there's always a group that jumps in with the same tired responses. You just don't understand it. It's made for the fans. You're not the target audience. That argument doesn't hold up anymore. The criticism isn't coming from people who hate Sword Art Online. It's coming from longtime fans who have supported this franchise for years. They've watched the anime, read the novels, played the games, and were genuinely excited for this game. If anyone should have loved this game, it was them. Instead, Many of those same fans are leaving negative reviews, refunding the game, and warning others not to spend $70 on it. So instead of dismissing every criticism or pretending the game is somehow beyond reproach, maybe it's time to acknowledge the obvious. People aren't criticizing the game because they hate Sword Art Online, they're criticizing it because they wanted it to be better. Defending every decision a company makes just because you love the franchise doesn't help anyone. If fans really want better Sword Art Online games in the future, they should be demanding higher quality, not making excuses for a release that so many players, including dedicated Sword Art Online fans, fell far short of its potential. One thing I find really ironic is how you'll sometimes hear people insist that Sword Art Online is this incredible franchise and that any criticism only comes from people who don't get it. But then you start reading the negative reviews for this game, and a huge number of them are coming from Sword Art Online fans themselves. Not casual viewers. Not people who randomly stumbled across the game. I'm talking about people who openly say they've watched the anime, read the light novels, read Progressive, played the older games, and have been waiting years for a game that finally captures the feeling of Aincrad. Those are the people leaving reviews saying they refunded it. Those are the people calling it repetitive, lifeless, restrictive, and not worth $70. Those are the people telling other fans to wait for a sale or skip it entirely. That's what makes this whole situation so ironic. The same audience that should have been the easiest to satisfy ended up becoming some of the game's biggest critics. To me, that says a lot. It's one thing when people outside a franchise don't enjoy a game. It's another when longtime supporters, who were genuinely rooting for it to succeed, come away feeling let down. At that point, it's hard to argue that all the criticism is just coming from haters. When the franchise's own fans are raising the same complaints over and over again, that's a sign those criticisms deserve to be taken seriously. Now, to be completely transparent, I've never played this game myself, and after everything I've seen, I have absolutely no intention of changing that. In fact, I've never played any of the Sword Art Online games, and this certainly isn't going to be the one that gets me to start. Why would I spend $70 on a game when I've just gone through review after review from people who actually bought it, played it, and in many cases desperately wanted to love it, only to end up calling it a disappointment? Many of them are lifelong Sword Art Online fans, and even they're telling people to wait for a sale or avoid it altogether. I'm not going to ignore all of that and pretend it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, consumers vote with their wallets. If a company releases a product that so many players believe doesn't justify its asking price, I'm not going to reward that by buying it anyway. So no, I'm not giving this franchise my money. Not for this game. From everything I've seen, the game simply hasn't earned it. It's still hilarious to me that this is a single-player game. Think about that for a second. Sword Art Online is literally built around the idea of 10,000 people being trapped inside a massively multiplayer online game. The entire franchise revolves around guilds, parties, raids, meeting other players, building friendships and rivalries, and surviving together in a living online world. And somehow the big modern Sword Art Online game is a single-player experience. How do you make a game based on one of the most well-known fictional MMOs ever created and leave out one of the defining aspects of an MMO? It almost feels like they completely missed what made the setting appealing in the first place. Imagine making a Pokemon game where you can't catch Pokemon, or a racing game where every race is against AI. Sure, technically it's still the same franchise, but you've stripped away one of the core fantasies people showed up for. That's what makes this so baffling. The whole appeal of Aincrad is the idea of thousands of players sharing this giant floating castle, forming guilds, tackling bosses together, trading, socializing, and creating their own stories. Instead, you're running around with AI companions in what many reviewers describe as a lifeless world. The irony is almost unbelievable. A franchise famous for its fictional MMORPG somehow ended up with a game that barely captures the feeling of being in an MMORPG at all. And here's another missed opportunity that I just can't get over. This isn't even a virtual reality game. Think about the source material for a second. Sword Art Online is one of the most famous virtual reality franchises ever created. The entire premise is built around the fantasy of putting on a headset, diving into another world, and feeling like you're actually inside the game. That's the core identity of the series. So how do you make a modern Sword Art Online game and not even offer a VR mode? I'm not saying every player would want to use it, and I understand it would take additional development effort. But if there was ever a franchise that naturally lends itself to virtual reality, it's Sword Art Online. Imagine exploring Aincrad in VR, looking up at the massive floating castle above you, manually swinging your sword, standing shoulder to shoulder with other players during a boss raid, or walking through the town of beginnings as if you were actually there. That's the fantasy people associate with Sword Art Online. Instead, what players got is another standard third-person action RPG. That's what makes it feel like such a missed opportunity. The series practically sells itself as the perfect blueprint for a VR experience, yet the game doesn't even attempt to embrace the technology that made the franchise famous in the first place. It just feels like another example of Bandai Namco playing everything as safely as possible. Rather than trying to create a truly unique Sword Art Online experience, they settled for something far more conventional. And when your source material is all about pushing players into a believable virtual world, choosing not to lean into virtual reality at all feels like another opportunity left on the table. Looking at everything that's happened, it's hard for me not to come away with the impression that this was a lazy cash grab. It feels like the developers relied more on the Sword Art Online name than on delivering a game that actually lived up to the series' potential. Instead of creating the ambitious Aincrad experience fans have been asking for over the last decade, they released a game that so many players describe as repetitive, restrictive, and lacking in basic features people expected from the start. It almost comes across as if they assumed the brand alone would be enough, that fans would see Sword Art Online, pull out their wallets, and buy it without asking too many questions. But that's clearly not what happened. The most interesting part of this entire review roundup isn't that random gamers are criticizing the game. It's that many of the harshest reviews are coming from dedicated Sword Art Online fans themselves. These are the people who should have been the easiest audience to satisfy. Instead, they're the ones refunding the game, telling others to wait for deep discounts, and questioning how Bandai Namco thought this justified a $70 price tag. Even the fanbase is becoming skeptical. And honestly, that's probably the biggest warning sign of all. When your own core audience, the people most willing to support you, starts losing confidence, that's something every developer should be paying attention to. Brand loyalty can only carry a game so far. Eventually, the product has to stand on its own. Based on everything we've covered, a lot of players don't think the game does. One last thing that still makes me laugh is the name of the developer. They're literally called Game Studio. That's it. Not some memorable name. Not something creative. Not something that stands out. Just Game Studio. It's almost comical. Of all the names you could possibly come up with for a game developer, you landed on the gaming equivalent. Of naming your restaurant Food Place or your movie studio Film Company. It honestly might be one of the least creative studio names I've ever seen. And maybe it's fitting because based on everything we've talked about, creativity seems to be the one thing this game is missing the most. When your game is being criticized for repetitive gameplay, restrictive exploration, recycled enemies, shallow systems, and a complete lack of ambition, having a developer named Game Studio almost feels like accidental satire. I'm not saying the name has anything to do with the quality of the game, but I can't help but laugh every time I see it. It's just such a painfully generic name that it perfectly matches how so many reviewers describe the experience itself. Generic, safe, and completely lacking in imagination. It would be like if my YouTube channel was literally called YouTube channel. That's it. Just YouTube channel. How unbelievably boring would that be? Imagine someone asking, "What's your channel called?" "Oh, it's called YouTube channel." "Oh, okay." That's exactly how I feel every time I see Game Studio. It's such a painfully generic name that it almost sounds like a placeholder they forgot to replace before launch. It's like naming your restaurant, your bookstore, or your band music group. Technically, it describes what it is, but it has absolutely zero personality. And honestly, considering how many people are describing the game as generic, safe, and lacking originality, the name almost feels unintentionally on brand. You couldn't script a more fitting coincidence if you tried. If I had to guess, this cycle is probably going to repeat itself. The next time Bandai Namco announces a brand new Sword Art Online game, watch what happens. The trailers will drop, the screenshots will look great, people will start speculating about all the possibilities, and suddenly everyone will convince themselves that this is finally going to be the Sword Art Online game they've been waiting for. This is the one. They've finally figured it out. This time it's going to be different. We've heard that before. Then the game launches, people actually get their hands on it, and reality starts setting in. The honeymoon period ends, the reviews start piling up, and many of the same complaints begin surfacing all over again. I think fans should be a lot more cautious. Don't let the marketing or the hype convince you to pre-order or buy day one. Wait until people have actually played it. Read the reviews. Watch real gameplay. See what longtime fans are saying after they've spent dozens of hours with it. Hype is easy to generate. Delivering a great game is the hard part. I'd be keeping my expectations in check. The $70 price tag is honestly laughable. We're living in a time where there are countless incredible games you can play without spending a single dollar. Games with years of content, massive communities, regular updates, and gameplay that keeps people coming back for thousands of hours. Then this game comes along and asks for $70. For what? According to so many of the reviews we've looked at, you're paying premium money for repetitive missions, restrictive exploration, recycled enemies, shallow combat, weak AI, and a world that feels strangely empty despite being based on one of the most exciting settings in anime. That's a hard sell. For the same amount of money, you could buy multiple critically acclaimed games during a sale. Or you could spend absolutely nothing and still have access to some genuinely fantastic free-to-play experiences that offer more content, more replayability, and in some cases, better gameplay. That's what makes the pricing so difficult to justify. Bandai Namco is charging as if this is one of the biggest, most polished RPGs of the year, but judging from the reviews, many players feel like they received something much closer to a budget title. Price always comes with expectations. If you ask people to pay $70, they're going to compare your game to every other $70 game on the market. And based on the reception, this game simply doesn't hold up to that comparison. The Sword Art Online name isn't enough to justify a premium price tag. The game itself has to earn it. And judging by everything we've covered today, a lot of players don't think it did. So what's the moral of this video? It's pretty simple. Don't waste your time and don't waste your money on the game. From everything we've gone through, the message from players is remarkably consistent. They talk about repetitive gameplay, fake open-world design, lifeless environments, shallow combat, weak AI, poor progression, and a premium $70 price tag that they simply don't believe the game earns. And remember, these aren't just random people looking for something to complain about. Many of the harshest reviews came from Sword Art Online fans themselves, the very audience this game was supposed to satisfy. These are the people who wanted this game to succeed more than anyone else, and many of them ended up refunding it or telling others to wait for a massive sale. That's probably the biggest takeaway from all of this. A great license can't save a bad game. Sword Art Online has one of the coolest settings in anime, a massive floating castle with 100 unique floors, endless opportunities for exploration, memorable boss fights, guilds, and the fantasy of surviving inside a virtual MMORPG. On paper, it should be almost impossible to mess up. And yet, according to a huge number of players, that's exactly what happened. So unless Bandai Namco makes some major improvements down the road, my advice is simple. Keep your $70. Spend it on a game that respects your time, rewards your curiosity, and actually delivers on what it promises. Because based on everything we've covered today, this game doesn't.